Hey guys, tonight we're heading to the front row of the Colosseum, the most prestigious seat in the Roman Empire, and quite possibly the worst place in the city to discover that a safety inspection has been skipped. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine that you are spending a perfectly ordinary day in ancient Rome. And by ordinary, I mean you are about to join 50,000 people gathering to watch armed men fight, exotic animals chase unfortunate victims, and an emperor judge the crowd's mood with the same seriousness modern people reserve for online reviews. You wake early because everyone else has the same idea. The streets leading to the Colosseum are already packed. Vendors are shouting. Citizens are pushing through the crowd. Somewhere nearby, someone is trying to sell questionable wine at an hour when respectable Romans should probably still be asleep. The massive amphitheatre rises above the city like a mountain of stone. And today, you have something special. A front row seat. Congratulations. You have achieved what every ambitious Roman dreams of, being close enough to the action that you can practically count a lion's teeth. The Colosseum was not just an entertainment venue. It was a giant stone diagram of Roman society. Every seat reflected status, wealth, and influence. The emperor occupied the finest position in the arena. Nearby sat his family, important priests, military commanders, and senators. These were the people who ran the empire, or at least argued loudly about how it should be run. Behind them sat wealthy equestrians. Farther back came ordinary citizens. At the very top sat those whose social rank provided a wonderful panoramic view of Rome and a somewhat less wonderful view of the actual entertainment. Your location told everyone exactly who you were. The closer you sat to the arena floor, the more important you appeared. Naturally, this created fierce competition. Romans loved status almost as much as they loved public spectacles. Sometimes it was difficult to determine whether a senator attended the games to watch gladiators, or to make sure everyone noticed that he was sitting closer than another senator. Human nature, it seems, has not changed very much. As you settle into your marble seat, you immediately notice something unusual. The arena is close, very close. Modern stadium designers generally prefer a comfortable separation between dangerous events and paying customers. Ancient Romans approached the problem differently. Their solution was essentially, what could possibly go wrong? A low, protective wall separated you from the arena floor. Beyond it stretched the famous sand-covered stage where gladiators fought and wild animals performed in spectacular hunts. From your seat, you can hear conversations below. You can see individual faces. You can watch handlers struggling to control nervous animals waiting beneath the arena. A modern safety inspector would likely take one look at the arrangement and retire on the spot. But to Romans, this was luxury. You were not supposed to feel safe. You were supposed to feel involved. The growl of a leopard was more exciting when it sounded close. A gladiator's sword strike felt more dramatic when you could hear the impact. Every spectacle became more thrilling when danger seemed just near enough to be real. And that was the attraction. Because while the front row offered the best view in the empire, it also came with an unspoken understanding. If anything escaped, missed its target, broke through a barrier, or otherwise decided to ignore the schedule for the day, you would be among the very first people to find out. As you sit in your front row seat, trying not to think too hard about the large cage being wheeled into the arena, it is worth taking a moment to appreciate exactly where you are. the Colosseum was one of the greatest construction projects of the ancient world. And unlike many government projects throughout history, it was actually completed. Construction began under Emperor Vespasian around the year 72. The massive amphitheatre rose on land that had previously belonged to Emperor Nero's extravagant palace complex. After Nero's death, the new rulers wanted to send a message. A very public message. Something along the lines of, "The Emperor's private lake is gone. You're welcome. Please enjoy the gladiators." Thousands of workers spent years hauling stone, pouring concrete, and assembling the enormous structure. When completed, the Colosseum stood nearly 160 feet high and dominated the Roman skyline. From a distance, it looked magnificent. From up close, it looked even bigger. As you enter through one of the 80 entrances, the engineering becomes obvious. Tens of thousands of spectators can find their seats with surprising efficiency. Staircases, corridors, and passageways guide people throughout the building. Modern sports stadium designers still admire the system. The Romans may not have invented smartphones, but they were remarkably good at moving large crowds without creating complete chaos. Most of the time. The arena itself measures roughly the size of a football field. A wooden floor covered with sand stretches across the centre. Beneath it lies a hidden world of tunnels, cages, elevators, and machinery. Animals wait below. Gladiators wait below. Workers wait below, probably wishing they had chosen a less stressful profession. From your seat, however, the most striking feature is not the arena floor. It is how little separates you from it. The protective wall around the arena stands only a few feet high. Additional barriers and metal screens existed in some areas, especially during animal hunts. Yet by modern standards, the distance between spectators and danger is astonishingly small. You could easily see every expression on a gladiator's face. You could hear animals roaring before they emerged. You could probably smell them too, which was an immersive experience nobody specifically requested. This closeness was entirely intentional. Romans did not come to the Colosseum merely to observe danger. They came to feel it. The crowd wanted excitement. They wanted tension. They wanted the sensation that something unexpected might happen at any moment. And as future chapters will reveal, sometimes something unexpected did happen, which was wonderful for the spectators sitting far away. For those in the front row, it was occasionally a much more personal experience. Now that you've settled into your expensive front row seat and admired the engineering marvel surrounding you, the morning entertainment is about to begin. And by entertainment, the Romans mean releasing large carnivores into an arena and seeing what happens. The morning portion of the games was usually dedicated to animal hunts, known as venaciones. These spectacles were among the most popular events in the Colosseum. Long before gladiators entered the arena, crowds gathered to watch exotic creatures from every corner of the empire. Lions arrived from North Africa. Leopards came from distant provinces. Bears were transported from forests hundreds of miles away. Occasionally, spectators could see elephants, rhinoceroses, crocodiles, ostriches, and animals most Romans had never encountered before. For many people in the audience, this was the closest thing to international travel they would ever experience. The animals, unfortunately, had not purchased tickets voluntarily. As the arena gates open, a lion emerges into the sunlight. The crowd erupts with excitement. From your seat you can see every detail, the muscles beneath its fur, the movement of its tail, the way it scans its surroundings. And suddenly you realize something. That lion is enormous. Ancient writers often described the thrill of seeing such creatures up close. Modern zoos keep dangerous animals behind thick glass, wide moats, and multiple security systems. The Romans preferred a simpler approach. There's a wall. Is it a very tall wall? No. Good enough. The barrier surrounding the arena offered protection, but it was not particularly reassuring. During hunts, additional metal screens were sometimes installed to prevent animals from reaching spectators. Nets could also be stretched along portions of the arena's edge. The fact that these precautions existed tells us something important. The Romans clearly understood that wild animals occasionally had ideas of their own, and wild animals are famously poor at respecting event schedules. Imagine sitting only a short distance from a leopard sprinting across the sand. You can hear its claws scraping the ground. You can hear its growls. If it changes direction suddenly, dozens of spectators instinctively lean backward. Not because they believe the barrier will fail, but because every human instinct is screaming that this creature belongs much farther away. The front row experience was therefore unlike anything modern audiences encounter. You weren't simply watching danger, you were sharing the same space with it. Most days, the barriers held. Most days, the animals stayed exactly where they were supposed to stay. But the reason spectators felt genuine excitement was because everyone understood one uncomfortable fact. Animals do not know they are participating in a carefully organised Roman entertainment programme. They only know that they are trapped, frightened, and surrounded by noise. And that occasionally made things very interesting for the people sitting closest to the arena. The reassuring thing about sitting in the front row of the Colosseum was that the Romans had installed barriers between you and the wild animals. The less reassuring thing was that the Romans felt the need to keep improving those barriers. That is usually a sign that something has gone wrong before. As the morning hunts became more elaborate, emperors competed to stage increasingly impressive spectacles. Hundreds of animals could appear during a single event. Exotic beasts were transported across continents to astonish Roman audiences. The larger the spectacle became, however, the more opportunities there were for chaos. And chaos has a habit of finding weaknesses. Ancient writers occasionally mention animals escaping control during public games. Not necessarily every week, and not necessarily in the Colosseum itself, but enough incidents occurred throughout the Roman world to keep spectators aware that things did not always go according to plan. A frightened animal is unpredictable. A wounded animal is even worse. Imagine sitting comfortably in your marble seat as hunters pursue a leopard across the arena. The crowd is cheering. The hunters are confident. Everything appears under control. Then the leopard decides it has absolutely no interest in the script prepared for today's performance. Instead of running where expected, it suddenly charges toward the arena wall. The audience gasps. People in the front rows instinctively pull back. Nobody knows exactly what will happen next. Perhaps the animal collides with the barrier and retreats. Perhaps the nets hold. Perhaps several very nervous handlers earn their wages all at once. Either way, your heart is probably beating faster than it was a moment ago. Roman engineers understood these risks. Protective nets were installed around sections of the arena. Metal rollers were sometimes placed on top of barriers to prevent climbing animals from gaining traction. Think about that for a moment. Someone specifically designed anti-lion architecture, which suggests that somebody, somewhere, had previously looked at a lion climbing something and decided improvements were necessary. Even when escapes were rare, the possibility remained part of the attraction. The audience loved uncertainty. Safe entertainment was available elsewhere. People attended the Colosseum because they wanted excitement. And nothing creates excitement quite like a reminder that the angry bear weighing several hundred pounds is not entirely committed to remaining on the correct side of the fence. Most spectators returned home safely after the games. Most animals never came close to the crowd, but every person sitting in those prestigious front row seats understood a simple truth. The barrier separating them from the arena was not there for decoration. It existed because, from time to time, the Colosseum's most dangerous performers forgot where the audience ended and the show began. By now, you may be thinking that the greatest danger in the front row came from lions, leopards, and other animals capable of removing your confidence in a matter of seconds. That was certainly one concern. Unfortunately, the Romans had worked hard to provide a wide variety of hazards. Once the morning hunts concluded, the arena remained filled with men carrying weapons. Lots of weapons. Sharp weapons. Weapons specifically designed to travel through the air at alarming speeds. And from your front row seat, you were close enough to appreciate every detail. Hunters used spears and javelins against animals. Gladiators occasionally threw weapons during combat. Special performers demonstrated military skills. Sometimes staged battles involved dozens of participants moving across the arena at once. The more people carrying weapons, the greater the chance that something would not go exactly where it was intended. Modern sporting events occasionally send a baseball into the crowd. Ancient Rome occasionally launched a spear. The stakes were somewhat different. Most professional fighters were highly trained. Gladiators represented expensive investments. Their owners did not want them behaving recklessly. A skilled gladiator was valuable, and valuable assets were generally encouraged to avoid accidentally impaling important senators. Still, combat is messy. Weapons break, hands slip, people miss. Anyone who has ever attempted a simple household task knows that humans possess a remarkable ability to make objects travel in unexpected directions. Now imagine that tendency combined with combat. Ancient sources occasionally mention weapons flying into spectator areas during public games. Such incidents appear to have been uncommon, but uncommon becomes much more noticeable when the object in question is a sharpened piece of metal. Even when no weapon entered the audience, the front row experienced plenty of collateral effects. Sand sprayed into the air, wood splintered, fragments of broken equipment scattered across the arena. A powerful strike could send pieces of shields flying. A charging animal might kick up clouds of dust. The people nearest the action received the most immersive experience available in the Roman Empire, whether they wanted it or not. Imagine spending good money on an excellent seat, only to return home covered in sand and explaining to your family that part of a gladiator's shield somehow landed in your lap. On the positive side, you would have an interesting story, assuming the story ended well. The Romans accepted these risks because closeness created excitement. They wanted the sensation of being part of the spectacle rather than merely observing it. And sitting in the front row certainly achieved that goal. Because every time a spear left someone's hand, there was a brief moment when everyone nearby hoped the thrower remembered which direction the arena was supposed to be. If you've managed to survive escaped animals, flying spears, and the general Roman approach to risk management, you might begin wondering why anyone would willingly choose a front row seat. The answer is simple. The view was incredible. Dangerous, perhaps, but incredible. From the highest seats in the Colosseum, spectators could certainly follow the action. They could see the movement of fighters and hear the roar of the crowd. But details were harder to make out. The front row offered something entirely different. You weren't watching the spectacle. You were practically inside it. From your marble seat, every movement became visible. You could see gladiators adjusting their grips before combat. You could watch nervous hunters preparing to face wild animals. You could even observe expressions on their faces. And those expressions often revealed far more than official Roman propaganda intended. A gladiator entering the arena might look confident from the upper levels, From the front row, you might notice that he was sweating enough to fill a small fountain. Ancient writers often describe the atmosphere inside the amphitheatre. The crowd produced a constant wall of sound. Tens of thousands of voices merged together into a deafening roar that echoed through the stone structure. When the audience approved of a performance, the noise was thunderous. When they disapproved, it was equally memorable. Imagine 50,000 Romans expressing disappointment. It would have sounded remarkably similar to 50,000 modern sports fans expressing disappointment. Some things never change. Then there were the smells. Modern documentaries rarely discuss this aspect, for understandable reasons. The arena contained animals, fighters, blood, sweat, sand, and thousands of spectators packed closely together beneath the Mediterranean sun. The result was not what most travel brochures would describe as refreshing. If you sat near the arena floor, every scent arrived in full strength. There was no escape, no stepping into an air-conditioned lobby, no politely worded complaint to management. You simply experienced ancient Rome exactly as ancient Rome smelled, whether you wanted to or not. Yet despite all this, elite Romans continued competing for the best seats, because closeness brought prestige. It also brought stories. Anyone could claim they attended the games. But only front row spectators could boast that they heard a lion roar from a few yards away, saw a gladiator's face moments before combat, or spent an afternoon dodging enough sand to qualify as part of the arena floor themselves. The front row transformed the games from a public spectacle into a personal experience. And that experience felt thrilling precisely because it blurred the line between audience and participant. The people sitting closest to the arena never forgot they were spectators, but sometimes the arena came close enough to remind them that they weren't as separate from the action as they might have preferred. As dangerous as the front row could occasionally be, there was one person in the Colosseum who always had the best seat: the emperor. If you were expecting Rome's ruler to watch the games from a safe location somewhere far above the arena, protected by multiple walls and a healthy respect for personal survival, you may be disappointed. Roman emperors preferred visibility. The imperial box, known as the pulvinar, occupied one of the most prestigious positions in the entire amphitheatre. It provided an excellent view of the arena while ensuring that every spectator could also see the emperor. And that was important. The games were not just entertainment, they were politics. Every appearance in the Colosseum reminded the population who paid for the spectacles, who commanded the empire, and who sat at the very top of Roman society. The emperor wasn't merely watching the show. In many ways, he was part of it. Imagine sitting among 50,000 spectators. Suddenly the crowd erupts into cheers before a single gladiator has entered the arena. The emperor has arrived. People stand. They wave. They shout praises. Some are genuinely enthusiastic. Others are making sure everyone notices how enthusiastic they appear. Again, human nature has changed remarkably little over 2,000 years. For most emperors, the games offered an opportunity to connect with the public. A popular ruler could earn tremendous goodwill through generous spectacles. Exotic animals, skilled gladiators, and lavish productions all helped build support. A boring emperor was dangerous. An entertaining emperor was beloved. Some rulers embraced this role enthusiastically, perhaps a little too enthusiastically. Emperor Commodus became famous for participating in arena spectacles himself. He fought animals, displayed his supposed combat skills, and presented himself as a heroic figure. Roman historians were not impressed. Many viewed the performances as embarrassing rather than glorious. Imagine being the most powerful man on earth and still desperately wanting attention from the crowd. Ancient Rome invented many things. Apparently, craving applause was one of them. Even emperors occasionally faced genuine risks during spectacles. Although protected by guards and positioned behind barriers, they remained relatively close to the action. An escaped animal or unexpected accident could create problems for everyone nearby. Fortunately, security around the emperor was extensive. Very extensive. Anyone hoping to reach him would first need to overcome layers of guards whose entire job description could be summarized as absolutely not. Still, the emperor's presence near the arena reveals something important about Roman attitudes. Danger added excitement. The ruler of the empire could have watched from a distant fortress. Instead, he sat close enough to hear the roar of lions and the clash of steel. Because in Rome, power was meant to be seen. And nowhere was it more visible than in the front row of the Colosseum, where even the emperor chose to sit just a few yards from controlled chaos. Most days at the Colosseum followed a familiar pattern. The animals appeared when they were supposed to appear. The gladiators fought where they were supposed to fight. The spectators cheered when they were supposed to cheer. And everyone went home with exactly the number of limbs they had arrived with. That was considered a successful day. But the Romans loved spectacle, because spectacle carried an element of unpredictability. No matter how carefully organisers planned an event, there was always the possibility that something unexpected would happen. And when 50,000 people realise something unexpected is happening at the same moment, the atmosphere changes very quickly. Imagine yourself sitting in the front row during a packed afternoon of games. The crowd is relaxed. Vendors move through the aisles. Senators discuss politics. Somewhere nearby, a wealthy Roman is pretending not to notice how loudly everyone admires his expensive toga. Then something goes wrong. At first, you're not even sure what it is. A sudden shout. A commotion among the handlers, several guards running instead of walking. The crowd notices immediately. Humans are remarkably good at detecting panic, especially when it involves other humans. The noise level shifts. Conversations stop. Thousands of eyes focus on the same spot. The comfortable certainty that everything is under control begins to disappear. And that's when the front row becomes the worst place in the building. People sitting high above the arena can afford curiosity. You cannot. Your brain immediately starts calculating distances. How far away is the problem? How fast can it move? Is the barrier actually as strong as everyone claims? Questions that never seemed important 5 minutes ago suddenly become very important indeed. Ancient writers occasionally described moments when crowds became frightened during public spectacles. Sometimes animals behaved unpredictably. Sometimes accidents interrupted performances. Sometimes rumours spread through the audience faster than facts. The result could be a wave of anxiety moving through tens of thousands of people. The Romans were not immune to panic. They were simply better dressed while experiencing it. One moment the crowd might be laughing and cheering. The next moment everyone is leaning forward searching for answers. Then comes the most uncomfortable phase of all, waiting. Waiting to learn whether the disturbance is minor or serious. Waiting to discover whether the guards are responding to a genuine threat or merely a performer who has forgotten where he is supposed to stand. Waiting while your imagination creates increasingly dramatic possibilities. Usually, the situation was resolved quickly. The crowd relaxed. The games continued. People laughed about their temporary fear. But for a few brief moments, spectators received a reminder that the Colosseum was not a theatre. It was a place filled with dangerous animals, armed men, and thousands of excitable humans. By now, it may seem strange that anyone would willingly pay for the privilege of sitting closest to lions, gladiators, and whatever disaster happened to be scheduled for the afternoon. Yet the front row remained one of the most desirable locations in all of Rome, because the front row was never just about watching, it was about being watched. As you take your seat near the arena floor, thousands of people can see you. Spectators entering the Colosseum immediately notice who occupies the prestigious lower sections. The closer a person sits to the arena, the more important they appear, and Romans cared deeply about appearances. In fact, they may have cared a little too much. A senator entering the Colosseum was not simply attending the games, he was making an entrance. His white toga, marked by the broad purple stripe of his rank, instantly announced his status to everyone around him. You could think of it as the Roman version of a luxury sports car. Less horsepower, more fabric. The front rows became a place where Rome's elite displayed their wealth and influence. Important politicians sat where everyone could see them. Military commanders occupied honoured seats. Priests and magistrates appeared before the public in carefully arranged positions. The games provided entertainment. The seating provided social theatre. Imagine arriving at the Colosseum and discovering you've been assigned a seat several rows farther back than your rival. You would still be close to the action, but your rival would know. His friends would know. The crowd might not notice, but you would notice, and that was enough. Roman society operated on reputation. Public image mattered enormously. A prestigious seat reinforced your position within the social hierarchy. This explains why front row spectators accepted risks that might seem absurd today. The danger was part of the attraction. A senator sitting calmly while a roaring lion passed nearby projected confidence and authority. Jumping backward every few minutes projected rather different qualities. Not that anyone could entirely suppress their instincts. Even the most dignified Roman could become surprisingly athletic if a leopard suddenly changed direction. The crowd understood this. Moments of tension often produced laughter as spectators reacted to unexpected scares. 1 minute, an aristocrat looked like a statue of Roman virtue. The next minute, he was discovering muscles he hadn't used in years. Yet once the danger passed, everyone settled back into their seats and resumed pretending they had never moved at all. That was the unwritten rule. No matter how alarming the spectacle became, maintaining dignity remained important. Because in the Colosseum, status was displayed as publicly as the games themselves, and if you occupied the front row, every spectator in Rome was watching not only the arena, they were watching you. If a normal day at the Colosseum involved lions, gladiators, executions, and enough weapons to concern a modern insurance company, special events took things to an entirely different level. Roman emperors were constantly competing with one another. Not through elections, not through debates, but through increasingly outrageous entertainment. Each ruler wanted to stage spectacles that people would remember for years. If the previous emperor displayed 50 exotic animals, perhaps you would display 100. If he organised a grand hunt, perhaps you would organise the largest hunt anyone had ever seen. The result was an escalating competition in extravagance, and whenever spectacles became larger, the opportunities for disaster grew larger as well. Imagine arriving at the Colosseum and discovering that hundreds of animals are scheduled to appear during the day's events. Not dozens. Hundreds. Lions, leopards, bears, wolves, wild boars, ostriches, and creatures imported from provinces many Romans could barely locate on a map. The arena floor becomes a controlled wilderness, or at least it is supposed to be controlled. The more animals involved, the harder control becomes. A handler loses track of one creature. A gate opens at the wrong moment. A frightened animal runs somewhere unexpected. Suddenly the people sitting closest to the arena become very interested in the quality of Roman engineering. Some emperors pushed spectacles even further. Emperor Trajan famously celebrated military victories with games that reportedly lasted for months. Thousands of animals and countless combatants participated in the festivities. The scale was astonishing. So was the logistical challenge. Coordinating such enormous events required armies of workers, trainers, guards, and organisers. Every moving part increased the possibility that something might go wrong. And sometimes things did, not necessarily catastrophically, but enough to keep the audience alert. Then there were the elaborate staged hunts. Artificial landscapes could be constructed inside the arena. Trees, rocks, and scenery transformed the space into a miniature wilderness. Animals emerged from hidden entrances while hunters pursued them across the sand. The crowd loved it. The participants probably had mixed feelings. From your front row seat, these spectacles felt incredibly immersive. You weren't simply watching a performance. You were sitting beside a performance involving dozens of frightened animals, armed men, and complicated machinery operating under enormous pressure. Remarkably, most events succeeded. The shows continued. The crowd cheered. The emperor received applause. Yet every grand spectacle carried a hidden truth. The larger the production became, the more fragile it became, because when hundreds of animals, thousands of workers, and tens of thousands of spectators gathered in one place, perfection was almost impossible. And for the people in the front row, even a small mistake could become a very memorable afternoon. As the morning animal hunts came to an end, workers entered the arena to prepare for the next phase of the day's entertainment. And if you happened to be sitting in the front row, this was often the moment when the atmosphere changed. The excitement remained. The crowd remained. But the mood became noticeably darker. The midday events were usually reserved for public executions. Unlike gladiatorial contests, which celebrated courage and skill, these spectacles focused on punishment. The individuals brought into the arena were criminals, prisoners of war, deserters, rebels, or people condemned by Roman courts, at least according to official records. Whether every condemned person actually deserved their fate is a question Roman authorities were generally not interested in discussing. As a spectator, you immediately notice the difference. Gladiators entered the arena armed and trained. The condemned often entered with little chance of survival. Sometimes executions involved wild animals. Sometimes they involved armed guards. Occasionally they became elaborate theatrical productions based on mythology. Unfortunately for the participants, Roman theatre occasionally included real deaths. Imagine sitting in the front row as a condemned prisoner is forced to reenact a famous mythological story. The crowd watches. The emperor watches. Everyone knows how the story will end, including the person standing in the arena. The Romans considered these spectacles demonstrations of justice and authority. Public punishment reinforced the idea that the state possessed absolute power. Fear was part of the lesson, and lessons tend to attract larger audiences when lions are involved. For spectators closest to the arena, these events could be more unsettling than gladiatorial combat. A gladiator at least possessed a chance. The condemned usually did not. The front row offered an uncomfortable level of detail. You could see facial expressions. You could hear voices. You could observe reactions that were invisible to spectators seated high above. This closeness made the experience more personal, and sometimes more difficult to ignore. Of course, not every Roman was troubled by what they saw. Many accepted executions as a normal part of public life. Some spectators even arrived specifically for these events. Ancient Rome was a society with very different ideas about entertainment. A modern audience might leave a sporting event talking about the final score. Romans could leave discussing whether the bear or the leopard had been more impressive. Civilizations evolve in interesting ways. Yet even among Roman spectators, reactions varied. Some cheered enthusiastically. Others watched quietly. A few probably wished the gladiators would hurry up and arrive. Because while the executions demonstrated Rome's power, they also served as a reminder of something unsettling. In the Colosseum, the line between spectacle and reality was often much thinner than anyone cared to admit. If Hollywood has taught us anything about ancient Rome, it is that gladiators spent most of their time charging wildly through arenas, leaping over barriers, and somehow ending up face to face with important spectators. The reality was somewhat less dramatic, which, for the senators sitting in the front row, was probably a relief. Gladiators were valuable investments. Training a fighter required time, money, food, equipment, instructors, and medical care. Successful gladiators could become celebrities throughout the empire. Arena owners did not spend years developing talented fighters, just to watch them sprint into the audience at the first opportunity. The games were carefully controlled. At least, that was the plan. As you sit in your front row seat, you notice that the arena is filled with officials. Guards stand near important entrances. Referees supervise the fights. Attendants remain ready to intervene if necessary. The Colosseum was not simply a battlefield. It was a highly organized production. Think less chaotic riot and more violent event management. Even gladiatorial combat followed rules. Referees could stop fights. Officials monitored behavior. Combatants were expected to perform according to established standards. This did not mean accidents never happened. Far from it. Gladiators fought with real weapons. Men were injured. Sometimes fighters lost their footing, stumbled toward barriers, or crashed into the edges of the arena while attempting to evade attacks. When two heavily armed men are trying not to be stabbed, precise navigation occasionally becomes a secondary concern. From the front row, these moments felt alarmingly close. A charging gladiator might rush toward the arena wall while pursuing an opponent. Spectators nearest the action would instinctively lean backward, not because they expected the fighter to leap into the crowd, but because human beings possess a remarkable talent for imagining worst-case scenarios. And few scenarios are worse than unexpectedly becoming part of a gladiator's workday. Historical evidence suggests that actual attacks on spectators by gladiators were extremely rare. Fighters understood their role. Guards remained nearby. Escaping the arena was virtually impossible. Where exactly would they go? The Colosseum contained 50,000 witnesses and approximately 0 exits marked "Freedom this way." Still, the illusion of danger remained powerful. A fighter rushing toward your section, a sword flashing in the sunlight, a body slamming against the barrier only a few feet away. These moments reminded spectators how thin the separation really was. The front row existed in a strange space between safety and risk. You were protected, mostly, yet close enough to feel every impact, hear every shout, and witness every desperate movement. And that was precisely why Romans paid so much to sit there, because nothing made the spectacle feel more real than occasionally wondering whether it was getting a little too real. After everything we've seen so far, escaped animals, flying weapons, charging gladiators, and Roman safety measures that occasionally relied on optimism, you may be asking the most important question of all. Did anyone in the front row actually die? The frustrating answer is the one historians often have to give. Maybe. Ancient Romans were surprisingly selective about what they chose to record. If an emperor won a military campaign, they wrote about it. If a politician insulted another politician, they wrote about it. If a wealthy senator built an impressive villa, they definitely wrote about it. But if a spectator named Marcus received an unexpected encounter with a panicked leopard during the games, the historical record becomes much quieter. This creates a problem. The Colosseum operated for centuries. Millions of spectators attended events. Yet surviving accounts focus primarily on emperors, gladiators, and major spectacles rather than individual audience members. That said, we know enough to reach some reasonable conclusions. First, deaths among spectators appear to have been uncommon. If large numbers of audience members were regularly being killed, Roman writers almost certainly would have mentioned it. The Colosseum would have gained a reputation as a dangerous place to sit rather than an exciting place to visit. Instead, attendance remained enormously popular. People kept coming back, which suggests that most spectators expected to survive the experience. A remarkably low bar for success, but an important one. Second, accidents undoubtedly occurred. Large crowds naturally produce accidents. Add thousands of animals, weapons, performers, and complex machinery, and occasional injuries become almost inevitable. History provides examples from other Roman arenas where spectators were harmed during chaotic events. Crowd crushes happened. Structures sometimes failed. Animals occasionally escaped control. The Roman world was not immune to disasters. The most famous example occurred not in the Colosseum, but in the amphitheatre at Fidenae, where a poorly constructed wooden arena collapsed during a show, reportedly killing and injuring thousands. Suddenly, the lion seems like only the second biggest concern. The lesson is clear. The greatest danger to spectators often wasn't a gladiator or a tiger. It was being surrounded by enormous crowds inside ancient structures where modern building inspectors had not yet been invented. As for the front row itself, it probably carried slightly greater risks than other sections. You sat closer to animals, closer to combat, closer to accidents, closer to everything. Yet even then, death was the exception rather than the rule. Most front row spectators returned home safely after the games, though they likely returned with a much stronger appreciation for barriers, distance, and the comforting realization that the lion had chosen someone else's section of the arena to investigate. So, after spending a day in the Colosseum, watching wild animals charge across the sand, seeing gladiators clash with steel, listening to 50,000 Romans roar with excitement, and occasionally questioning the wisdom of sitting so close to all of it, we finally arrive at our original question. How dangerous was the front row of the Colosseum? The answer is surprisingly Roman. Dangerous enough to be exciting, safe enough to keep selling seats. The reality sits somewhere between modern imagination and historical fact. If you picture front row spectators being regularly eaten by lions, history offers little evidence for that. The Colosseum functioned for centuries because it generally worked. The barriers usually held. The guards usually maintained control. The animals usually remained where they were supposed to remain. Usually. And that word did a tremendous amount of work, because the front row was never completely safe. You sat only a short distance from powerful predators. You watched armed men fight with real weapons. You occupied seats near machinery, animals, crowds, and spectacles that could become unpredictable in an instant. Modern audiences tend to expect absolute safety. Romans expected reasonable safety. These are not the same thing. A Roman senator likely understood that attending the games involved certain risks, but he also understood that prestige required visibility. Important people sat in important places, and important places happened to be very close to lions. That was simply part of the arrangement. In many ways, the front row symbolized the Roman Empire itself. It was grand, it was impressive, it projected confidence, and underneath that confidence was a quiet acceptance that life could be dangerous. The Romans admired courage. They respected displays of composure under pressure. Sitting calmly while a leopard prowled nearby sent a message about status and character. Of course, privately, many spectators were probably just hoping the leopard felt equally calm. As the sun begins to set and the crowd slowly leaves the Colosseum, you rise from your seat one final time. The arena floor is covered with footprints. Workers are already preparing for tomorrow's events. Thousands of spectators stream toward the exits, discussing the day's most memorable moments. And that may be the greatest clue of all. The Romans did not leave talking about the safety barriers. They talked about the excitement, the danger, the feeling of being close to something extraordinary. Because the front row of the Colosseum was never meant to make you feel comfortable. It was designed to make you feel alive. And 2,000 years later, that combination of danger, spectacle, and human curiosity is precisely why we are still talking about those seats today. In Celtic society, a king could possess hundreds of warriors, vast herds of cattle, and enough land to ride across for days. He might win battles, build alliances, and intimidate his rivals. Yet none of those achievements guaranteed that future generations would remember him. For that, he needed a bard. To modern ears, this sounds almost absurd. If you were assembling a tribe, you would probably choose a few extra warriors before selecting a poet. A warrior can protect your cattle. A poet, at first glance, appears capable only of describing the cattle in unusually flattering language. The Celts saw things differently. Across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and much of the ancient Celtic world, memory was one of the most valuable resources a society could possess. Long before printing presses, government archives, or shelves packed with books, history survived because certain people carried it in their minds. Those people were the bards. Imagine entering a great timber hall on a winter evening. Rain beats against the roof. Smoke curls upward from a central fire. Warriors crowd the benches with cups of ale in hand. At the far end sits the king, surrounded by nobles and champions. Then the bard rises. Almost immediately the room grows quiet. No one wants to miss what comes next. The bard begins reciting the deeds of ancestors long dead. He names kings, battles, marriages, victories and heroic journeys. Generations unfold through spoken verse. Events that happened centuries earlier suddenly feel alive again. For the audience, this is not merely entertainment. It is history. It is identity. It is proof of who they are. A ruler's authority often depended on ancestry. If a king claimed descent from famous heroes or legendary founders, the bard preserved that claim. If a noble family wished to demonstrate its importance, the bard could recite its lineage before an entire gathering. Without poets, many of these memories might disappear forever. This gave bards extraordinary influence. They became historians, genealogists, diplomats, advisors, and guardians of cultural memory. Their words helped shape how rulers were viewed by both allies and rivals. But their power extended even further. A talented bard could immortalize a king through praise. Songs celebrating victories might travel across entire regions. Future generations could remember a ruler centuries after his death. Yet the opposite was also true. A biting satire could humiliate a nobleman in front of his peers. In a society built heavily on honor and reputation, public mockery was no small matter. Some rulers feared a bard's sharp tongue almost as much as an enemy's spear. A warrior could win glory on the battlefield. A bard decided whether anyone would remember it. If becoming a warrior in Celtic society required strength, courage, and skill with weapons, becoming a bard demanded something far more intimidating. You had to study, for years, possibly decades. And unlike a warrior, who could occasionally solve problems by hitting them with a spear, a bard had no such option when forgetting an important genealogy in front of a king. The path usually began in childhood. A promising young student would enter the service of an established bard and begin a long apprenticeship. From that moment forward, much of his life revolved around learning, memorizing, and reciting. The amount of information expected was astonishing. A bard had to master ancient stories, tribal histories, heroic legends, family lineages, poetry, laws, and traditional wisdom. Some Irish sources suggest advanced poets memorized thousands upon thousands of verses. Entire libraries existed only inside human minds. You can imagine the challenge. Most people today become annoyed when they cannot remember where they left their keys. Celtic bards were expected to remember the ancestors of half the kingdom, stretching back generations. Training methods reflected the seriousness of the task. Students often learned through constant repetition. Verses were recited aloud again and again until they became second nature. Teachers corrected every mistake. Accuracy mattered because a forgotten detail could alter a family history or distort an important tradition. In medieval Irish bardic schools, which preserved many older Celtic traditions, students reportedly spent long hours composing and memorizing poetry under demanding conditions. Some accounts even describe pupils working in small rooms with limited distractions, focusing entirely on the words they were expected to master. The education extended beyond memory. A bard needed a deep understanding of language itself. Poetry was considered a highly skilled art form. Verses followed strict structures, rhythms, and patterns. A talented poet could weave complex meanings into elegant lines that audiences would remember for years. As students advanced, they gradually earned higher ranks within the bardic profession. The most accomplished poets occupied prestigious positions at royal courts and advised kings directly. By the time training was complete, a bard had become far more than a performer. He was a walking archive, a living record office, a human library carrying centuries of knowledge without a single written page. The result was a figure unlike almost any other in Celtic society. Warriors defended the tribe's present, kings shaped its future, but the bard protected its past. And without that past, neither kings nor warriors could truly understand who they were. The years of training transformed a bard into a living storehouse of knowledge. But all that memorization served a larger purpose. Someone had to remember. In Celtic society, history was not locked away in dusty archives. It was carried from place to place by people. When disputes arose over land, inheritance, or status, the answer often depended on memory. And when memory mattered, the bard mattered. Imagine two noble families arguing over who possessed the stronger claim to a particular territory. There are no filing cabinets to consult. No government office waiting to provide official records. Instead, respected poets and learned men are asked to recite the histories and genealogies that establish those claims. Suddenly, remembering a great-grandfather's marriage from 80 years ago becomes surprisingly important. This was one reason rulers valued bards so highly. A king's authority rested partly on ancestry. The more impressive his lineage, the stronger his position appeared. If a ruler could trace his family back to legendary heroes, famous kings, or even mythical ancestors, his prestige increased enormously. The bard preserved those connections. At feasts and assemblies, poets could recite family trees stretching back generations. Listeners heard names linked together like chains reaching into the distant past. These genealogies reminded everyone that power was not simply being claimed, it was inherited through an honoured line. Of course, remembering these enormous family networks was no easy task. Many noble families were connected through marriage, alliance, and shared ancestry. A skilled bard needed to keep track of relationships that would make modern family reunions seem refreshingly simple. Yet genealogy was only part of the job. Bards also preserved the stories of entire tribes. They remembered migrations, victories, defeats, treaties, and famous leaders. When people gathered during festivals or royal ceremonies, these stories reinforced a shared identity. A warrior might defend his tribe with a spear. The bard defended it with memory. His stories reminded people where they came from and what connected them to one another. Heroes became examples for future generations. Great victories inspired pride. Ancient disasters provided lessons. Without these storytellers, much of Celtic history would have vanished long ago. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the bard's profession. Many kings ruled for a few decades. Many warriors fought for a few years. But the bard served as a bridge between centuries, carrying the voices of the dead into the ears of the living. In a world without written records, that responsibility was priceless. The bard's knowledge of history and genealogy made him valuable. But it was inside the king's hall that his importance became impossible to ignore. Picture a royal feast in Celtic Ireland or Britain. The fire crackles in the centre of a great timber hall. Noble guests arrive from neighbouring territories. Warriors boast about recent victories. Servants move between benches carrying platters of roasted meat and overflowing drinking horns. At the head of the gathering sits the ruler. Nearby sits someone almost as important, the bard. His position was no accident. Seating arrangements in Celtic society reflected status, and respected poets were often given places of honour close to the king himself. This was a public reminder that words carried power. As the feast progresses, the bard begins his performance. He recites poems celebrating the ruler's generosity. He recounts famous victories won by the king's ancestors. He reminds everyone present of ancient alliances, heroic deeds, and noble traditions. The audience listens carefully, partly because the stories are entertaining, partly because they are educational, and partly because no one wants to be the person caught sleeping during a performance that includes their own family history. The bard's role extended beyond simple praise. Every recital reinforced the social order of the kingdom. The king was reminded of his duties. Warriors heard their courage celebrated. Noble families saw their place within society reaffirmed. A well-crafted poem could strengthen loyalty more effectively than a dozen speeches. People tend to remember stories. Very few people remember administrative announcements. The bard understood this perfectly. Through carefully chosen words, he shaped how events were viewed. A difficult victory could become a legendary triumph. A generous gift could become evidence of a ruler's greatness. A diplomatic alliance could be presented as the fulfillment of ancient destiny. This influence required skill and caution. A bard could not simply invent history. Audiences knew many of the events being described. Exaggeration was expected, but credibility still mattered. The finest poets balanced truth, tradition, and artistry in ways that elevated their patrons without losing the audience's trust. For kings, this was invaluable. a ruler could command obedience through force. He could collect tribute through authority. But earning admiration was much harder. That is where the bard excelled. Night after night, feast after feast, he transformed political power into something far more enduring: reputation. And in Celtic society, a king's reputation could outlive his kingdom, his descendants, and even the hall where the poem was first sung. The bard's ability to praise a ruler was valuable. His ability to criticize one was terrifying. In Celtic society, words were not viewed as harmless sounds drifting into the air. They carried weight, they shaped reputations, they influenced how entire communities viewed an individual. Because honour was one of the foundations of Celtic culture, damaging a person's reputation could have serious consequences. This gave the bard a unique kind of power. While warriors wielded spears and kings wielded authority, poets wielded something far less visible, but often just as effective: public opinion. One of the bard's sharpest weapons was satire. A skilled satirical poem could humiliate a nobleman before his peers. It could expose greed, cowardice, arrogance, or broken promises. Worse still, the mockery might spread beyond a single gathering, carried by travellers, and repeated in halls far from where it was first spoken. Imagine spending years building your reputation as a fearless warrior, only to become famous because a bard composed a clever verse comparing your bravery to that of a frightened sheep. The embarrassment could be difficult to escape. Many Celtic traditions treated satire with remarkable seriousness. In Irish literature, poets are sometimes described almost as possessing magical abilities through their words. Some stories even suggest that a powerful satire could bring shame, misfortune, or physical blemishes upon its target. Whether people literally believed such things or not, the underlying message was clear. Poets were not individuals to offend lightly. This influence acted as a subtle check on rulers and nobles. A king could punish ordinary critics, he could intimidate rivals, but openly mistreating a respected bard carried risks. The poet's response might spread through the kingdom, damaging the ruler's standing among allies and subjects alike. As a result, many rulers treated their court poets with considerable respect. Generous gifts were common. Land grants, valuable clothing, livestock, and privileged positions at court helped ensure good relations. Supporting a bard was often viewed as an investment in prestige. Of course, not every poet spent his days attacking noblemen. Most preferred praise to conflict, especially when praise came with rewards attached. Still, everyone understood the possibility. Behind every elegant poem and flattering tribute stood a sharp mind capable of turning admiration into ridicule if circumstances demanded it. That combination made the bard one of the most unusual figures in Celtic society. He was neither king nor warrior, yet even powerful rulers often thought carefully before making an enemy of him. After all, a spear wound eventually healed. A reputation damaged by a great poet might survive for generations. The bard's influence did not end when the feast was over. Once the songs had been sung, the guests had gone home, and the drinking horns were empty. Many rulers continued seeking the poet's counsel. This might seem surprising. After all, bards are usually remembered as storytellers, not political advisors. Yet in Celtic society, the two roles often overlapped. Think about it from a king's perspective. Who in the kingdom knew the history of alliances stretching back generations? Who remembered ancient disputes between neighbouring tribes? Who could recall how previous rulers handled a similar crisis 50 or 100 years earlier? Very often, the answer was the bard. Years of education had filled poets with far more than stories. They possessed knowledge of law, tradition, genealogy, and politics. They understood how families were connected, which rivalries remained unresolved, and which promises had been made by previous generations. In many ways, they served as living reference books. Except, unlike a book, a bard could answer questions. A ruler considering marriage alliances might consult a bard to understand family connections. A chief negotiating with a neighbouring tribe might seek advice about past agreements. Even disputes over succession could require a poet's expertise. The bard's memory became a practical political tool. This made him valuable during diplomatic gatherings. When delegations arrived from other territories, poets often played important ceremonial roles. They welcomed guests, recited genealogies, and reminded everyone of shared ancestry or old friendships. Such performances were not merely polite entertainment, they were diplomacy. Imagine two rival chiefs sitting across from one another after years of tension. A bard begins recounting the heroic deeds of ancestors who once fought side by side. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer focused solely on recent disagreements. It is connected to a larger shared history. That could help ease negotiations. Poets also travelled more widely than many ordinary people. Moving between courts allowed them to gather news, observe political developments, and carry information from one region to another. In an age without newspapers, that knowledge was extremely valuable. A wise ruler paid attention to what his bard had heard. Over time, some poets became trusted confidants of kings. Their advice was not always followed, but it was often respected. This reveals something important about Celtic society. The ideal leader was not expected to rely solely on force. Strength mattered, courage mattered, but wisdom mattered too, and few people possessed more accumulated wisdom than the bard, whose mind contained the experiences, successes and failures of countless generations before him. The bard advised kings, preserved history, and shaped reputations during a ruler's lifetime. But perhaps his greatest power appeared after that ruler was dead. Most Celtic kingdoms were small by modern standards. Borders shifted constantly. Dynasties rose and fell. Strongholds that once seemed permanent could be abandoned within a few generations. Yet some names survived. Why? Because a bard remembered them. In a world without mass literacy, stories were the closest thing to immortality. A warrior might perform incredible deeds on the battlefield, but if nobody recorded them, those achievements could vanish within a generation. A king might rule wisely for decades, but without someone to preserve his memory, future descendants might barely know he existed. The bard stood between glory and oblivion. When a great ruler died, poets often composed elegies celebrating his accomplishments. These were not simple funeral speeches. They were carefully crafted works designed to ensure that future generations would continue speaking the ruler's name. The best bards transformed history into legend. A successful battle became an epic struggle. A skilled chief became a larger-than-life hero. An ordinary victory gained layers of symbolism and meaning. Over time, the line between history and legend sometimes became difficult to see. Consider the famous heroes who appear throughout Irish and Welsh traditions. Figures such as Cú Chulainn, Fionn McCumhail, and many others survived, not because they left written memoirs behind, but because generations of storytellers continued reciting their tales. The stories changed and evolved, but the names endured. That was the bard's gift. He could preserve a person's memory long after their descendants were gone. Of course, this power carried responsibility. A careless poet could distort events. An overly loyal bard might exaggerate achievements beyond recognition. Audiences expected a degree of embellishment, but they also valued authenticity. The greatest poets found a balance between celebrating their subjects and preserving meaningful truths. For rulers, this made bardic support invaluable. Winning a battle provided immediate rewards. Being remembered centuries later was something far rarer. Many kings understood this perfectly. That is why poets received gifts, privileges, and places of honour. Patronizing a bard was not merely an act of generosity, it was an investment in legacy. Long after a king's hall collapsed and his descendants disappeared into history, a story could continue travelling from one generation to the next. The kingdom might be gone. The bard's words might be all that remained, and sometimes that was enough to make a mortal man feel immortal. For centuries, bards occupied a position near the centre of Celtic society. Kings relied on them. Warriors respected them. Families depended on them to preserve their histories. Then a powerful new force arrived: Christianity. Beginning in the early centuries after Christ, missionaries gradually spread across Celtic lands. Monasteries appeared where sacred groves once stood. New religious ideas took root. The old pagan world that had nurtured generations of bards began to change. At first glance, it might seem like the bard's profession was doomed. After all, many traditional poems celebrated pagan heroes, ancient gods, and beliefs that Christian clergy viewed with suspicion. Monks were now writing histories on parchment, preserving information in a way that did not depend entirely on memory. For the first time, the bard faced competition from books. Yet something remarkable happened. Instead of disappearing, many bardic traditions adapted. The wisest poets understood that survival often requires flexibility. They continued preserving genealogies, histories, and heroic tales, but increasingly did so within a Christianized society. Meanwhile, monks themselves began recording many of the old stories. Ironically, some of the greatest Celtic legends survived because Christian scribes copied them into manuscripts. Tales that had once been passed from bard to bard were now written down, ensuring their survival for centuries. Without those efforts, much of Celtic mythology might have vanished completely. The relationship between clergy and poets was not always smooth. Church leaders occasionally criticised wandering storytellers and performers. Some viewed them as relics of an older age, but rulers still valued the skills of trained poets. A king in Christian Ireland still needed someone who could recite his ancestry. A noble family still wanted its achievements remembered. A kingdom still required historians. As a result, bardic schools continued operating long after Christianity became dominant. In medieval Ireland, highly trained poets retained impressive status. Some spent years mastering complex verse forms and studying traditional learning. Their profession evolved, but its prestige endured. The world around them had changed dramatically. The old gods faded. Monasteries multiplied. Written records became increasingly common. Yet the bard remained. That persistence reveals just how deeply Celtic society valued the spoken word. Empires rise and fall, religions spread, political systems transform, but people never stopped wanting their stories told. And as long as stories mattered, there was still a place for the bard. Even in a Christian world, rulers continued to understand an ancient truth. A kingdom needs soldiers to defend it, but it also needs someone to remember why it existed in the first place. By now, the bard's place in Celtic society should seem far less mysterious. He preserved history. He advised rulers. He strengthened alliances. He protected family reputations. He could elevate a king's status or damage it through satire. Most importantly, he ensured that the achievements of a ruler survived beyond a single lifetime. This explains why Celtic kings often valued poets almost as much as warriors. At first glance, the comparison seems unfair. A warrior defended borders, fought enemies, and risked his life in battle. When danger threatened the tribe, it was not the bard who stood in the shield wall. Yet rulers understood something that many people overlook. Winning a battle was only part of ruling. The harder task was convincing people that the victory mattered. Imagine a chief who defeats a rival tribe in a brilliant campaign. His warriors fight courageously, his strategy succeeds, his kingdom expands. Then 20 years pass. Many of the veterans die. Another generation grows up. Soon only fragments of the event remain in people's memories. Without someone preserving the story, the victory slowly fades. Now imagine the same event with a skilled bard present. The day begins before sunrise. There is no alarm clock, no fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen, and certainly no stack of fluffy pancakes waiting to improve your mood. You are in ancient Sparta, where comfort is viewed with deep suspicion and breakfast is not considered an exciting event worth discussing. A faint grey light creeps over the mountains surrounding the Eurotas Valley. Roosters crow, dogs bark in the distance. Smoke begins rising from simple homes as families prepare for another day in one of the most disciplined societies the ancient world would ever produce. A Spartan citizen rises from his bed. He is not thinking about food, at least not in the way most people do today. For Spartans, meals were fuel, necessary, important, but never the centre of life. The ideal Spartan admired endurance, self-control, and toughness. A man who constantly complained about hunger or obsessed over luxurious meals risked appearing weak. This attitude shaped everything about the Spartan table. The citizen dresses quickly and prepares for the duties ahead. Military training, public obligations, inspections, and communal activities dominate his schedule. Personal pleasure ranks surprisingly low on the list. Soon, a simple morning meal appears. Nothing extravagant. Perhaps a piece of coarse barley bread, a few olives harvested from local groves, some goat cheese, dried figs if the season has been generous. Watered wine may accompany the meal, though not in excess. The portions are modest. Modern visitors expecting an enormous warrior's breakfast might be disappointed. After all, Sparta produced some of Greece's most feared soldiers. Surely they started the day with heroic quantities of food? Not quite. Spartan culture deliberately encouraged moderation. Hunger was considered manageable. In fact, young boys undergoing the famous agoge training system were often kept slightly hungry on purpose. The idea was that discomfort built resilience. You can imagine the reaction of a modern teenager informed that constant hunger is actually part of the educational curriculum. The breakfast disappears quickly. There is little ceremony, no lingering conversations around the table, no second helping because it is a stressful Tuesday. The meal has accomplished its purpose. It provides enough energy to begin the day while reinforcing a lesson every Spartan learned from childhood. The body must serve the mind, and the mind must serve the state. As the sun climbs higher over Laconia, the morning meal is already finished. The real work of being Spartan is about to begin, and as the hours pass, hunger will return. That, too, is part of the lesson. The simple meal that began the morning was only one part of a much larger Spartan philosophy. In Sparta, breakfast was not designed to impress anyone. It was designed to prepare you for work. As the first light spreads across the Eurotas Valley, men, women, and children throughout the city begin eating their modest morning food. Yet, despite sharing the same culture, not everyone experiences breakfast in quite the same way. A young boy in the agoge, Sparta's famous training system, has perhaps the hardest start to the day. From the age of 7, Spartan boys entered a world built around discipline, endurance, and obedience. Food was intentionally limited. The goal was not starvation, but constant mild hunger. Instructors believed that boys who learned to function while uncomfortable would become stronger soldiers as adults. This created an unusual educational system. Most schools reward good performance with praise. Spartan schools occasionally rewarded it with slightly more food. The boys typically ate simple staples: barley bread, cheese, olives, and whatever additional provisions were available. Hunger remained a constant companion. In fact, boys were encouraged to steal food when the opportunity arose, not because theft itself was admired. The real lesson was resourcefulness. If a boy was caught stealing, he was punished severely, not for taking the food, but for being careless enough to get caught. It was a remarkably Spartan solution to the problem. Meanwhile, adult Spartan men ate somewhat better, though not by much. Their morning meal remained simple and practical. Bread formed the foundation of most diets. Barley was especially important because it grew well in the region and could be transformed into porridge, cakes, or coarse loaves. Olives were another staple. Olive trees covered much of the Greek landscape and provided a reliable source of food and oil. A handful of olives might accompany breakfast, adding flavour to an otherwise plain meal. Goat and sheep cheese frequently appeared as well. These provided valuable protein and could be stored for longer periods than fresh foods. Fruit, particularly figs, offered occasional sweetness. For Spartans, this counted as luxury. You are not exactly browsing a menu filled with honey pastries and stuffed dates. The emphasis remained on moderation. As breakfast ended, no one lingered around discussing flavours or debating recipes. The meal had one purpose: provide enough nourishment for the duties ahead. Soon the training grounds would fill with young boys. The fields would fill with workers. The city would return to its routines. And the Spartan breakfast, brief and unremarkable by design, would quietly disappear into the demands of the day. The modest breakfast has done its job. Now, as the city stirs fully awake and daily duties begin, it is worth asking a simple question. Where did all this food come from? After all, barley bread does not magically appear on a Spartan table. Olives do not march themselves into storage jars. Someone has to grow the grain, tend the vineyards, herd the animals, and harvest the fruit. And here we discover one of Sparta's greatest contradictions. The warriors who became famous throughout Greece spent remarkably little time farming. Others did that for them. Much of Sparta's food came from the fertile lands of Laconia and neighbouring Messenia. These regions possessed rich soil, mild winters, and enough rainfall to support agriculture. Compared to many parts of Greece, Sparta was fortunate. The countryside produced the essentials of the Spartan diet. Barley fields stretched across the landscape, providing the grain used for bread and porridge. Olive groves supplied fruit and valuable oil. Vineyards produced wine, usually diluted with water before drinking. Sheep and goats provided milk, cheese, wool, and occasional meat. At first glance, it sounds almost idyllic. Rolling fields beneath the Greek sun, farmers tending crops, olive trees swaying in the breeze. The reality, however, was more complicated. Much of this agricultural work was performed by the helots. The helots were not slaves in the traditional household sense, nor were they free citizens. They occupied a unique and deeply uncomfortable position within Spartan society. Bound to the land, they farmed the fields and supplied a significant portion of the food that sustained the Spartan state. While Spartan citizens trained for war, the helots planted grain. While Spartan boys learned discipline, the helots harvested olives. While Spartan men attended communal meals, the Helots worked the land that made those meals possible. In many ways, the entire Spartan system depended upon their labour. Without them, the famous warrior society would have struggled to function. The food itself reflected the agricultural rhythms of the region. Fresh produce appeared seasonally, figs ripened during the warmer months, grapes arrived during harvest season, olives were gathered in autumn before being processed into oil or preserved for later consumption. Nothing was wasted. A poor harvest could create real hardship. A good harvest provided security. This constant connection between food and agriculture shaped Spartan attitudes toward eating. Every loaf of barley bread represented months of labour. Every olive reflected careful cultivation. As the sun climbs higher over the fields surrounding Sparta, workers continue their tasks. And while the warriors receive much of history's attention, it is the people behind the plough who are quietly feeding the entire city. The farms surrounding Sparta have supplied the food. The breakfast has long since disappeared. Now the sun hangs high over Laconia, and hunger begins creeping back into the stomachs of the city's citizens. This is the middle of the day, when many ancient societies paused for substantial meals. In wealthier parts of Greece, some people might enjoy extended dining, conversation, and moments of relaxation. Sparta, unsurprisingly, approached the matter differently. You are not here to be entertained. You are here to be useful. For most Spartan men, the hours between sunrise and sunset were filled with responsibilities. Military drills, physical exercise, inspections, public duties, and communal obligations occupied much of their attention. Even adult citizens who had completed their training were expected to maintain their fitness and readiness. Food had to fit around that reality. Midday meals were generally simple and practical. A Spartan might eat more barley bread, olives, cheese, or seasonal fruit. If available, there could be small amounts of meat or fish. The goal was nourishment rather than satisfaction. The distinction mattered. A satisfied man might become comfortable. A comfortable man might become soft. At least that was the fear. Spartan culture constantly emphasized self-control. Citizens were expected to master their desires, whether those desires involved luxury, wealth, or simply taking an afternoon nap after a large meal. As a result, overeating carried a certain stigma. A Spartan was supposed to leave the table capable of working, training, and fighting if necessary. Stuffing yourself until movement became difficult would have been viewed as ridiculous. Not that anyone needed to explain this. After a few hours of military drills beneath the Greek sun, the disadvantages of a massive lunch become fairly obvious. Young boys in the Agog continued experiencing this philosophy most intensely. Their meals remained deliberately limited. Hunger was part of daily life, teaching endurance and resilience. The system aimed to produce men who could function effectively even when conditions were less than ideal. And conditions were often less than ideal. Military campaigns rarely arrived with fully stocked kitchens. Battlefields were not famous for their dining options. The Spartans wanted soldiers who could tolerate discomfort without complaint. Even water consumption reflected discipline. While hydration was necessary, excess was discouraged. Moderation governed nearly everything. As midday passes and the heat settles across the valley, Spartan citizens return to their duties. The meal is over almost as soon as it begins. No elaborate courses, no lingering at the table, no lengthy debates about whether the olives paired well with the cheese. There is work to be done, and in Sparta, duty always arrives before dessert. The midday meal is finished. For most Spartans, it was enough to keep them moving through the afternoon. But enough was not always the same as satisfying. In fact, many Spartans spent much of their lives slightly hungry. This was especially true for young boys undergoing the agog. Their meals were intentionally limited, forcing them to think creatively about obtaining additional food. The state wanted future soldiers who could survive shortages, adapt to difficult situations, and remain resourceful when supplies ran low. As a result, hunting, fishing, and gathering became valuable skills. A Spartan boy wandering through the countryside might search for wild berries, edible plants, or figs growing beyond cultivated orchards. Streams and rivers offered opportunities to catch fish. Forested hills contained rabbits, birds, and other small game. None of this was guaranteed. That was part of the lesson. Success required patience, observation, and effort. The countryside surrounding Sparta became a giant classroom where nature itself served as the instructor. Young Spartans learned how to move quietly, recognize animal tracks, and understand the habits of prey. Skills useful for hunting often proved useful during military campaigns as well. After all, sneaking up on a rabbit and sneaking up on an enemy scout require surprisingly similar levels of discretion. Failure, meanwhile, usually resulted in continued hunger. Nature could be a demanding teacher. Fishing also supplemented the Spartan diet. The nearby rivers and coastlines provided access to fish and shellfish, which added variety to meals that otherwise relied heavily on grain and olives. Fresh fish was particularly valuable because it offered protein without requiring the expense of slaughtering livestock. Meat itself remained relatively uncommon for ordinary Spartans. Contrary to popular imagination, they were not feasting on roasted animals every evening. Sheep, goats, and pigs represented valuable resources. Animals provided milk, wool, labour, and breeding stock. Slaughtering them was not always the most practical choice. When meat did appear, it was often connected to hunting, sacrifices, or special occasions. This made successful hunts especially rewarding. Imagine returning to camp with a freshly caught hare after days of eating little more than bread and olives. Suddenly, you are not merely a hunter. You are the most popular person in the vicinity. As the afternoon wears on, these additional food sources help fill the gaps left by Sparta's deliberately modest meals. Yet they also reinforce a deeper lesson. The Spartans believed comfort created weakness, resourcefulness created strength, and sometimes the difference between the two was nothing more than a hungry boy, a rabbit in the brush, and the determination to catch it before sunset. The afternoon is fading. The hunting is done. The training grounds are growing quieter. Shadows stretch across the streets of Sparta as citizens prepare for the meal most famously associated with their city. And now we arrive at the dish that terrified visitors, confused foreigners, and somehow became one of the most famous recipes in ancient history. Black broth. Even the name sounds slightly threatening. If you are expecting honey cakes or roasted delicacies after a long day, Sparta has disappointing news for you. Black broth was a simple stew traditionally made from pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. The exact recipe remains uncertain because ancient cooks had the irritating habit of not leaving detailed cookbooks behind. Still, ancient writers described it often enough that its reputation survived. Unfortunately, the reviews were mixed. Very mixed. One famous story tells of a visitor from another Greek city tasting black broth and finally understanding why Spartans were so willing to die in battle. After trying the soup, death may have briefly seemed like the more appealing option. The story is almost certainly exaggerated, but it reveals how unusual the dish appeared to outsiders. To Spartans, however, black broth represented something deeper than flavour. It symbolised simplicity. It symbolised discipline. Most importantly, It symbolized the rejection of luxury. Other Greek cities often celebrated elaborate cuisine. Wealthy households displayed status through expensive ingredients and sophisticated meals. Sparta intentionally moved in the opposite direction. The ideal Spartan was supposed to eat what was necessary, not what was fashionable. Black broth fit perfectly into that philosophy. After a day of physical activity, the stew provided nourishment. Pork supplied protein and fat. The broth itself was filling and practical. It was not designed to impress guests from Athens. In fact, impressing Athenians ranked fairly low on Sparta's list of priorities. The dish frequently appeared at communal meals where citizens gathered to eat together. Everyone shared similar food regardless of wealth. This reinforced the idea that all Spartan citizens were members of the same warrior community, at least in theory. As evening approaches, bowls of dark broth are distributed among the diners. Steam rises into the cooling air. Bread accompanies the meal, helping soften the intensity of the stew. Some men eat without comment. Others exchange stories from the day's activities. No one expects culinary excitement. That is not the purpose. The purpose is nourishment, fellowship, and discipline. And if the food happens to taste slightly better than wet battlefield equipment, that is simply an unexpected bonus. Soon the communal dining halls will fill completely. There, black broth becomes more than a meal. It becomes a symbol of Sparta itself. The black broth has been served. The day's labour is ending. But for an adult Spartan citizen, dinner is not something enjoyed at home with family around a private table. Instead, he heads toward one of the most important institutions in Spartan society, the Syssitia. These communal dining groups were far more than simple meal gatherings. In many ways, they were the beating heart of Spartan citizenship. Every adult male citizen belonged to one. Every evening, members gathered to eat together, talk together, and reinforce the bonds that held Spartan society together. Imagine entering a large dining hall as darkness settles outside. Oil lamps flicker against stone walls. The smell of stew hangs in the air. Groups of men take their places on benches. Some are seasoned veterans with grey in their beards. Others are younger citizens eager to prove themselves. Everyone is expected to contribute. Membership in a Syssitia required regular contributions of food, including grain, wine, cheese, figs, and other provisions supplied from a citizen's allotted land. Failure to provide these contributions could have serious consequences. In fact, losing your place in a dining group could mean losing your standing as a full Spartan citizen. That is how important these meals were. The food itself remained simple. Black broth often appeared alongside bread, cheese, olives, and occasional portions of meat. No one attended expecting a luxurious feast. The purpose was not pleasure. The purpose was unity. As the meal progresses, conversations flow across the hall. Military matters are discussed. Local news is exchanged. Stories are shared. Older men pass along lessons learned through experience. Younger men listen carefully, absorbing the values expected of future leaders and soldiers. The Syssitia functioned almost like a nightly classroom, except the classroom served wine. Moderately, the atmosphere encouraged equality among citizens. Wealth existed in Sparta, but communal dining helped prevent excessive displays of luxury. At least during these meals, every man ate largely the same food and participated in the same rituals. This reinforced one of Sparta's most important ideas. The individual mattered less than the community. Every bowl of broth, every piece of bread, and every shared conversation reminded citizens that they belonged to something larger than themselves. As the evening continues, laughter occasionally breaks through the serious discussions. Friendships strengthen. rivalries soften, trust grows, and that trust would matter enormously when these same men eventually stood together in battle. The Syssitia was not merely where Spartans ate dinner. It was where Sparta itself was quietly rebuilt every single night. The Syssitia has shown us the everyday reality of Spartan dining: simple food, shared meals, strict discipline. Yet even Sparta, perhaps the least likely place in Greece to host a culinary celebration, occasionally loosened its belt. Not very much, but enough. For all their reputation as stern warriors, Spartans were still human beings. They celebrated religious festivals, honoured the gods, marked important victories, and gathered for public ceremonies. During these occasions, the food could become noticeably more generous. The key word, however, is noticeably by Spartan standards. An Athenian visiting one of these feasts might still wonder whether the cooks had misplaced half the menu. Many celebrations centered around religious sacrifices. Throughout Greece, sacrifices played a major role in public life. Animals were offered to the gods, but unlike modern assumptions, much of the meat did not go to waste. After the ritual, participants often shared the food in communal meals. For ordinary Spartans, this could be one of the few opportunities to enjoy larger portions of meat. The smell alone must have been enough to attract attention. After weeks of bread, cheese, olives, and black broth, a properly roasted animal would seem almost miraculous. Festivals dedicated to gods such as Apollo, Artemis, and other important deities brought people together from across Spartan territory. Athletic competitions, music, dancing, and religious ceremonies often accompanied the meals. This is one of the most surprising aspects of Sparta. The city is often imagined as a place where everyone spent every waking moment sharpening spears and glaring at each other. Reality was more complicated. Music remained important. Religious celebrations remained important. Community gatherings remained important. Even warriors occasionally enjoyed themselves. The food served during festivals reflected the resources available. Roasted meat, additional bread, wine, fruits, and special offerings might appear. Honey, one of the ancient world's favourite sweeteners, could transform ordinary foods into rare treats. Imagine tasting honey-covered cakes after months of Spartan restraint. You would probably remember the experience for years. The celebration, however, never lasted forever. Spartan culture remained deeply suspicious of excess. Feasting was acceptable. Indulgence was not. The goal was to honour the gods and strengthen the community, not lose yourself in luxury. As the festival draws to a close, the fires burn lower and the crowds begin returning home. Tomorrow the familiar routines will return. The black broth will return. The discipline will return. But for one evening, Sparta has briefly revealed a different side of itself. Not just a city of warriors, a city of people. The festival is over. The laughter fades. The fires burn low. Families return home. Warriors leave the dining halls. And darkness slowly settles across the valley of the Eurotas. Another day in Sparta is coming to an end. If you look back across the meals of the day, something becomes clear. The Spartans were not simply eating. They were practicing a philosophy. From the first piece of barley bread at dawn to the final bowl of broth after sunset, every meal reflected the values that made Sparta famous throughout the ancient world. Discipline, moderation, endurance, community. A modern visitor might find the Spartan table surprisingly plain. Breakfast lacked excitement. Lunch was practical rather than enjoyable. Dinner often featured the infamous black broth that had frightened generations of foreign guests. There were no celebrity chefs, no secret family sources, no debates about whether the olives were locally sourced. Sparta would have been a difficult place for a food critic to build a career, yet the simplicity served a purpose. The Spartans believed that luxury weakened character. A man who constantly chased comfort might struggle when comfort disappeared. A soldier accustomed to rich meals might find hardship unbearable during a campaign. So they trained themselves to need less food, less comfort, less pleasure. The goal was not misery, the goal was freedom. A person who could function with little was harder to intimidate and harder to defeat. The sun is sinking toward the horizon. You have spent the entire day marching. Your feet hurt, your shoulders ache. The pack on your back feels twice as heavy as it did at sunrise. Dust covers your sandals. Sweat has soaked through your tunic. At this point, you would happily eat almost anything placed in front of you. Unfortunately, you are a Roman legionary, and dinner is still a long way off. As the marching column finally reaches its destination, the soldiers do not immediately begin cooking. They do not unpack food. They do not gather around campfires. First, they build an entire fortified camp. Every single night. To modern eyes, this sounds slightly insane. Imagine walking 20 miles carrying equipment, then arriving home and deciding the perfect way to relax would be constructing a defensive fortress before dinner. The Romans considered it normal. Orders are shouted down the line. Soldiers immediately begin working. Surveyors mark out the camp's layout. Units move to their assigned positions. Tools emerge from packs. Within minutes, thousands of men are digging. A ditch begins to take shape around the camp's perimeter. Earth removed from the trench is piled inward to create a defensive bank. Wooden stakes carried by the soldiers are planted along the top, forming a protective barrier. The process is exhausting, and it is absolutely non-negotiable. Roman commanders understood that tired soldiers were vulnerable soldiers. A secure camp could mean the difference between sleeping safely and waking up to enemy warriors charging through the darkness. The walls come first. The food comes later. As twilight deepens, the camp slowly transforms into a small city. Streets appear in carefully organised rows. Gates are established. Tents rise across the interior. Officers inspect progress, while soldiers continue working with practiced efficiency. This routine repeats itself so often that most legionaries can perform it almost automatically. Only after the defences are completed do thoughts finally return to food. Now the atmosphere begins to change. Shovels are put aside. Tools are stacked neatly. Small groups of soldiers head toward their tents. Some begin gathering firewood. Others unpack cooking equipment. A few fortunate men may already be dreaming about the evening meal waiting in their packs. The smell of smoke soon starts drifting across the camp. After hours of marching and construction, dinner is finally approaching. But the Roman army has already demonstrated its priorities. Before bread, before stew, before even a single bite of food, comes the camp, because hungry soldiers can survive one more hour. Dead soldiers cannot. The camp walls are finished. The ditch has been dug. The gates are guarded. The tents stand neatly arranged in rows. For the first time since sunrise, the legionaries can finally think about something other than marching, digging, or not being ambushed. Now they can think about dinner. But before any food appears, another task awaits. The Roman soldier must unpack his kitchen. This might sound impressive until you realise that a Roman military kitchen was not exactly a luxurious affair. No polished copper pans, no shelves full of spices, no cheerful grandmother asking if you've eaten enough. Just practical equipment carried by men who spent much of their lives on campaign. Most legionaries belonged to a small group called a contubernium, usually 8 men who shared a tent and worked together. They also cooked together. That arrangement made life considerably easier. One man could gather firewood, another could fetch water, someone else could prepare the grain. Meanwhile, one particularly unlucky soldier might discover that he had accidentally become the evening cook. Again. As equipment emerges from packs, the camp begins to feel more like a temporary village than an army. Small cooking pots appear first. These were among the most important possessions a soldier could carry. Iron or bronze pots allowed food to be boiled into stews, porridge and soups. They were sturdy, practical, and capable of surviving years of military service. Unlike some soldiers, wooden bowls and cups are unpacked next. Simple knives emerge from leather sheaths. Spoons appear. Occasionally small hand mills are prepared for grinding grain. Nothing is decorative. Everything has a purpose. That practicality reflected the Roman military mindset. Equipment was judged by usefulness, not appearance. A beautiful cooking pot that cracked during a campaign was worthless. An ugly one that survived 10 years of marching was a masterpiece. The real treasure, however, was often hidden inside the food sacks. Wheat grain, barley, dried legumes, cheese, salted meat. These supplies represented survival. Without them, even the most disciplined army quickly became a collection of hungry men carrying weapons. As darkness approaches, hundreds of tiny cooking areas begin appearing throughout the camp. Fires are prepared but not yet lit. Water is brought from nearby streams or wells. Ingredients are sorted and shared among tent mates. The transformation is remarkable. Only an hour earlier, these men were labourers building fortifications. Now they are cooks preparing supper. The evening meal is still not ready. But the tools are in place. The ingredients are waiting. And across the camp, thousands of hungry Romans are about to begin one of the most important tasks of military life, turning rations into dinner. The cooking pots are unpacked. The grain sacks have been opened. The soldiers are hungry. There is just one small problem. None of this food can be cooked without fire, and fire requires fuel. As the last daylight begins fading from the sky, groups of legionaries leave the safety of the camp and spread into the surrounding countryside. Some carry axes, others carry bundles of rope. Everyone understands the mission. Find wood. Find a lot of it, and find it quickly. This may not sound particularly dramatic. After all, gathering firewood is hardly the sort of task that usually appears in heroic military paintings. Nobody commissions a statue titled "Victorious Roman Carrying Sticks." Yet the Roman army understood a simple truth. An army marches on discipline, but it sleeps better after a hot meal. Wood is needed for cooking bread, boiling porridge, preparing stews, and warming cold soldiers after difficult marches. Without fuel, the evening meal becomes considerably less appealing. Few things damage morale faster than chewing dry grain after a 20-mile march. The easiest solution is nearby woodland. If the camp has been established near forests or groves, soldiers can quickly gather fallen branches and dead timber. Experienced legionaries know exactly what to look for. Dry wood burns best. Green wood creates smoke. Lots of smoke. The kind of smoke that makes everyone cry while pretending they are not crying. Not every campsite is so convenient, however. Sometimes the army marches through open countryside where trees are scarce. In such cases, gathering enough fuel becomes much more difficult. Soldiers may need to travel farther from camp or rely on smaller materials such as brush and shrubs. Weather creates additional challenges. A week of rain can turn a simple task into a miserable ordeal. Wet wood burns poorly, damp fires produce more smoke than heat. Cooking takes longer. Dinner arrives later. Nobody is happy. Winter campaigns can be even worse. Now the soldiers need fuel not only for cooking, but also for warmth. A freezing legionary tends to become very enthusiastic about finding firewood. As darkness deepens, men begin returning through the camp gates carrying armfuls of branches. Small piles of fuel appear beside tents throughout the camp. Soon the first fires flicker to life. One by one, orange points of light spread across the Roman camp. The smell of smoke fills the air. The crackling of burning wood replaces the sound of marching boots. At last, the camp begins to feel alive. The fuel has been gathered. The fires are burning. And now the most labour-intensive part of dinner can finally begin. The grain must be ground. The firewood has been gathered. The cooking fires are finally burning. The smell of smoke drifts through the camp as darkness settles over the Roman countryside. At last, dinner seems close. Then someone remembers an unfortunate detail. The grain still needs to be ground. For many Roman soldiers, this was the least exciting part of the entire evening. Marching 20 miles was difficult. Building a fortified camp was exhausting. Grinding grain afterward somehow managed to feel even worse. Unlike modern people, Roman soldiers did not receive neatly packaged loaves of bread ready for consumption. The army commonly distributed grain as part of its rations, usually wheat. This had advantages. Whole grain travelled well, spoiled slowly, and could survive long military campaigns. The disadvantage was obvious. Someone had to turn it into flour. That someone was usually the soldier. Across the camp, hand mills begin appearing beside the fires. These simple devices consisted of 2 heavy stones. Grain was poured between them and crushed by rotating one stone against the other. The process was straightforward. It was also incredibly repetitive. Imagine spending an entire day marching under the sun, carrying armour, weapons, tools and supplies. Then imagine being told that before dinner you need to spend another hour turning a stone in circles. The Roman army rarely concerned itself with your opinion on the matter. So the work begins. The grinding produces a steady sound throughout the camp. Stone scraping against stone, grain cracking and breaking apart. Small clouds of flour dust floating into the evening air. Members of each contubernium often shared the task. 8 men lived together. 8 men cooked together. And when possible, 8 men complained together. Conversation helped pass the time. Stories from previous campaigns are exchanged. Rumours spread through the camp. Someone claims he once saw a German warrior taller than a horse. Nobody believes him, but the story is entertaining enough to survive another evening. Slowly the flour accumulates. Some groups mix it with water to create a simple dough for flatbread. Others prepare porridge, which requires less effort and fewer cooking steps. Both options are common throughout the Roman army. Neither is glamorous. Both are effective. And effectiveness matters more than glamour when your profession involves crossing mountains and occasionally fighting Gauls. As the grinding finally comes to an end, weary soldiers stretch aching arms and examine the results of their labour. The grain has become flour. The flour can become food. For the first time all evening, dinner feels genuinely close. Now the cooking can truly begin. The grain has been ground. The fires are burning steadily. The hardest work of the evening is finally over. Now comes the reward. Dinner. Across the Roman marching camp, hundreds of small cooking fires flicker in the darkness. What had been a construction site only a few hours earlier now resembles a sprawling village. Smoke curls upward into the night sky. Pots hang over flames. Soldiers gather around their cooking areas, eager for the first proper meal since the day's march began. This is the moment everyone has been waiting for. The meal itself is not luxurious. Far from it. Roman military food was built around practicality. The army needed meals that could be prepared quickly, transported easily, and provide enough energy to keep soldiers marching and fighting. Fortunately, practical food often becomes surprisingly appealing when you've spent the day carrying 70 pounds of equipment. One of the most common dishes is pulse, a thick porridge made from wheat or barley. Flour is mixed with water and slowly heated over the fire until it becomes a filling, hearty meal. It is not beautiful, it is not exciting, but it is warm. And after a long day on the road, warm food can feel like a gift from the gods. Nearby, another group is baking flatbread. Small rounds of dough are pressed onto heated stones or placed near the coals. The smell of fresh bread spreads through the camp. Suddenly, everyone becomes very interested in whose bread is almost finished. Legumes frequently appear as well. Lentils, beans, and peas are common ingredients in Roman military cooking. They store well, travel well, and provide valuable nutrition. Added to a pot with water and a few seasonings, they create a simple stew capable of feeding several hungry soldiers. Vegetables might also find their way into the meal. Onions, garlic, leeks, and cabbages are especially useful. These ingredients are inexpensive, durable, and capable of making almost anything taste better. Even Roman soldiers understood the magical powers of garlic. Many meals combine several ingredients into a single pot. Grain, vegetables, legumes, and bits of preserved meat simmer together over the fire. The result is less a carefully crafted recipe and more a practical solution to the problem of hunger. Yet there is something comforting about it. The day's marching is over. Weapons are stacked nearby. Armour rests beside tents. For a short while, the soldiers are not builders, labourers, or warriors. They are simply men sharing food with friends. As steam rises from the cooking pots and the first bowls are passed around, the camp settles into a quieter rhythm. The evening meal has finally begun. The porridge is simmering. The bread is baking. The camp is finally beginning to smell less like a construction project and more like a place where human beings live. Yet while grain formed the backbone of the Roman military diet, soldiers did not survive on porridge alone. Sooner or later, everyone wanted meat. The challenge was getting it. Feeding a few hungry men is difficult enough. Feeding an entire legion, along with its support staff, animals, and accompanying personnel, was a logistical puzzle that would make modern event planners develop a sudden interest in early retirement. The Roman army solved this problem through organisation. Lots of organisation. One of the most common sources of protein was salted pork. Pork was relatively easy to preserve and transport, making it ideal for long campaigns. Large pieces could be packed in salt and stored for extended periods without spoiling. The downside was that it could become extremely salty. After several weeks on campaign, a soldier might begin dreaming of food that did not taste as though it had spent its life at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Still, hunger is an excellent seasoning. The pork was often chopped into stews or boiled alongside vegetables and grain. Even a small amount could transform an otherwise ordinary meal into something far more satisfying. Bacon was another favourite, not because Romans were secretly modern people, because bacon has been improving morale for thousands of years. Cheese also played a major role. Durable, nutritious, and easy to transport, it provided valuable protein when fresh meat was unavailable. A chunk of hard cheese could survive conditions that would destroy many other foods. Roman soldiers learned to appreciate such reliability. Fresh meat appeared less frequently, but was highly valued. Livestock sometimes accompanied military columns. Animals could be slaughtered when necessary, providing fresh supplies for the troops. Local purchases also supplemented rations. In friendly territories, merchants often followed armies. eager to sell food to thousands of customers who happened to be carrying swords. Sometimes soldiers hunted. Sometimes commanders arranged large-scale supply deliveries. Sometimes captured enemy stockpiles, unexpectedly improved dinner. One of the great advantages of winning a battle was discovering that the enemy had thoughtfully gathered food in one convenient location. Behind every meal stood a vast supply network stretching across the empire. Farmers, merchants, wagon drivers, sailors, quartermasters, and countless labourers all contributed to keeping food moving toward the front lines. Most soldiers rarely thought about this system. They simply saw a bowl of stew. Yet without that logistical machine, the Roman army would have struggled to march very far at all. As the meat finishes cooking and the aroma spreads through the camp, one truth becomes clear. Armies may win battles, but logistics wins wars. The meat has been cooked. The stew is ready. The bread has cooled enough that it no longer threatens to remove the roof of your mouth. At last, the soldiers can sit down and eat. But in a Roman marching camp, meals were rarely solitary affairs. Every legionary belonged to a contubernium, a small group of 8 soldiers who shared a tent, equipment, duties, and daily life. If the Roman army was a giant machine, the contubernium was one of its smallest and most important parts. These men marched together, worked together, fought together, and every evening they ate together. Around hundreds of campfires, groups of soldiers settle onto stools, packs, or whatever happens to be available. Bowls are passed around. Bread is torn apart and shared. Someone ladles stew into wooden dishes. The atmosphere changes immediately. The formal discipline of the day begins to relax. Not disappear, just relax. For the first time since morning, the men can enjoy a few moments of normal conversation. Stories start flowing as freely as the wine. One soldier complains about the day's march. Another claims the distance was nothing compared to a campaign he experienced years earlier. A veteran describes a battle in Gaul for what is probably the 100th time. The details become slightly more impressive with every retelling. By now, the enemy warriors are practically giants. No one minds. The story is part of the entertainment. Humour thrives around these fires. Roman soldiers were notorious for joking, teasing one another, and complaining about officers whenever it seemed reasonably safe to do so. Every group had its personalities. The loud one, the reliable one, the one who somehow managed to burn dinner despite having cooked it dozens of times before, the one who always borrowed things and mysteriously forgot to return them. Military life created strong bonds. After all, these were the men who would stand beside you during a battle. Trust mattered. Shared meals helped build that trust. The evening fire became a place where friendships formed and strengthened. It also became a place where information spread. News travelled quickly through the camp. Rumours about future campaigns, possible promotions, enemy movements, and distant events passed from group to group. By the end of the evening, half the camp might be discussing a story that had started as a simple comment over dinner. Some rumours were true, many were not. Military camps have never lacked creativity. As darkness deepens and the meal draws to a close, the contubernium settles into a comfortable rhythm. Tomorrow will bring another march, another camp, another evening meal. But tonight, gathered around a shared fire, 8 soldiers enjoy something almost as valuable as food: companionship. The evening meal with the contubernium has restored spirits. The bread is gone. The stew pot is nearly empty. The soldiers are relaxed for the first time all day. Most nights in a Roman marching camp followed this predictable pattern. Grain, porridge, bread, legumes and preserved meat formed the foundation of military life. But every so often, something unusual happened, something exciting, something that made soldiers talk about dinner for weeks afterward. A luxury appeared. Now, luxury in a Roman camp should be understood in military terms. We are not discussing silver platters, exotic desserts, or chefs imported from distant provinces. For a legionary who had eaten porridge for 6 consecutive days, an extra piece of fresh meat could qualify as a miracle. One source of unexpected treats was local trade. Merchants often followed Roman armies, setting up near camps whenever conditions allowed. They knew thousands of hungry soldiers represented a profitable opportunity. If a soldier had a few coins to spare, he might purchase fresh fruit, vegetables, wine, honey, eggs, or other foods unavailable through standard rations. Suddenly, dinner became far more interesting. A handful of fresh apples could feel like treasure after weeks on the road. Then there was hunting. Occasionally, soldiers managed to catch rabbits, deer, birds, or other game. A successful hunt could dramatically improve the evening meal. The lucky hunters instantly became the most popular men in the tent. Strangely enough, this remains true in most centuries. Campaigns in fertile regions also provided opportunities for fresh supplies. Farmers sold livestock, villages offered produce, markets became available. Entire armies could temporarily enjoy a more varied diet than usual. And then there was the most famous source of unexpected abundance: victory. Victorious armies often captured enemy food stores. Grain, wine, livestock, and preserved foods could suddenly fall into Roman hands. After weeks of strict rations, such discoveries transformed camp morale almost overnight. The defeated enemy rarely appreciated this arrangement. The Romans, however, tended to view it quite favourably. Special occasions could bring additional rewards. Commanders sometimes distributed extra wine after important victories or successful campaigns. Religious festivals might involve sacrifices followed by communal feasts. On rare occasions, entire units enjoyed celebrations that broke the monotony of military life. For a few hours, the hardships of marching seemed far away. The soldiers laughed louder. The conversations lasted longer. The food tasted better. Tomorrow, the ordinary routine would return. The porridge, the bread, the endless marching. But tonight was different. Tonight, the Roman soldier enjoyed a reminder that even in one of history's most disciplined armies, there was still room for the occasional luxury. The special meal is over. The extra wine has been drained. The last scraps of bread have disappeared. The laughter around the campfires begins to fade as the evening grows late. Across the Roman camp, darkness settles over thousands of men preparing for another day on campaign. The fires still burn, but not as brightly as before. Most of the cooking is finished. The pots have been scraped clean. And now, for the first time since dawn, the soldiers can rest. It is a remarkable transformation. Only hours earlier, this patch of land was empty countryside. There were no streets, no walls, no gates, and no tents. By nightfall, Roman discipline has created an entire temporary city,